pick 20%. No, he did that because he had to. He had to convince creditors to hold on to this debt because they knew how high inflation was, and he had to be serious. But so the same thing's going to happen. Our creditors are going to want more and more interest, but we're not going to be able to pay it. We are so leveraged up at this point. Americans are so deeply indebted, and the government itself, we've got an $11 trillion national debt right now. We didn't have that in 1980. And of course, the national debt is financed with T-bills. A third of the national debt comes due in the next year. Back in 1980, the national debt was all 30-year government bonds. So when interest rates went up to 20%, it only affected the money the government borrowed that year and a small amount of debt that was maturing. But today, if interest rates went up to 10% or more, it would affect the entire national debt. But where are we going to get the money to make interest payments on this national debt? It's just a gigantic adjustable rate mortgage. It's the same as individuals. We're on the teaser rate right now. We got a teaser rate. When that teaser rate expires and it resets, we've got a default. Just like Americans, you know, we're going to need to modify the debt or get an interest rate reduction or a cram down or something. But the U.S. government's probably not going to have the integrity to default in an honest manner. So as the world doesn't want to buy the debt, or Americans don't want to buy the debt because the interest isn't high enough to offset for the lost purchasing power, then the monetization really begins to kick in because more and more of the debt is bought by the Treasury. And of course, the more of our debt the Treasury buys, the less it's worth because every time the Fed buys our debt, it prints the money to do it. And therefore, if you don't sell, you're going to take a loss. So it creates a self-perpetuating spiral, whereas the Fed is printing money to buy bonds, everybody wants to sell their bonds to the Fed because no one wants to be left holding the bag. And so you get this spiral, and then prices are going to start to run out of control. And I think what's going to happen sometime before the end of the Obama term is that we're going to have price controls in this country. We're going to have price controls on food products. We're going to have price controls on energy. And what's that going to do? That's going to create shortages. It's going to create long lines. That's going to create black markets. That's going to create a whole new class of criminals. Because obviously, if you deal in the black market, you're a criminal. The government's going to usurp all sorts of new powers. We're probably going to have exchange controls. A lot of bad things are going to happen. A lot of more power is going to be grabbed by the government as it does more and more damage. So anybody who thinks that this is the economic collapse, no. I mean, this is the overture. We still have the opera. Anyway, okay, let me stop now and take questions. Are there any questions? Yeah.
And we're in a recession now, and he seems so positive about everything. It just seems so sort of counterproductive.
Yeah, well, Kramer is clueless. He doesn't know anything about economics. I mean, he doesn't understand. I mean, he thinks it's all about printing money. He thinks that the Fed can save the day. He's saying in Bernanke we trust. Right. He thinks that what Bernanke is doing is going to work. Well, why didn't it work in Zimbabwe then? We're doing the same thing. Any other questions?
You guys want to come up to the mic here?
Okay.
Raise your hand first.
So then what's your advice for the few of us who are responsible and have zero debt so that we don't get killed by the inflation?
Yeah, well, you're the patsies in this whole thing. I mean, people who did the right thing, who saved their money, you're going to be asked to fund all the stimuluses. You're going to be stuck with the bill because it's your savings that are going to get inflated away. And that was the whole premise of the investment advice of my book, to understand that the riskiest asset to own is U.S. currency or U.S. dollar-denominated assets because your interests are going to be sacrificed because the creditors are in the minority. The debtors have all the votes. In fact, a lot of the creditors don't have any vote. They're not even American. So obviously, it's the creditors who are going to be sacrificed, especially since the U.S. government is the biggest debtor of us all. And so inflation is their only solution. And inflation is the enemy of anybody who has treasuries or muni bonds or bank accounts. And so forget about the fact that the government says, oh, don't worry, your accounts are insured by the FDIC. The insurance is meaningless. All they insure to do is give you your money. But they don't insure that your money is going to have any value. In fact, they practically insure that it won't have any value. If they have to print all the money to make good all these promises, it won't have value. So the solution, unfortunately, is you got to get out of the dollar. And that further undermines our economy. We need Americans to save their money in the U.S. so that it can be invested in the U.S. But unfortunately, the policies that we're pursuing are destructive to savings. They discourage savings, and they force savers to flee. But that's what we have to do, because otherwise your savings will get wiped out. So you need to invest abroad, you need to own foreign currencies, foreign stocks, precious metals, and hopefully one day when this insanity stops and we can finally begin to address these problems, you can bring that money back and help invest in building the economy of the future.
There's a group of people out there that agree with your overall diagnostic, but they question your prediction of hyperinflation. Their argument is that the credit destruction that's happening right now is so large that it doesn't matter how much money the government print, it's still a drop in the bucket. And they mention, as an example, the case of Japan in the 80s, where they run very large deficits. It failed as a policy, but they never saw hyperinflation. How do you respond to that?
Well, they didn't run them to the size that we're going to. But the difference between Japan and the United States is Japan was a very productive economy. Japan had a high savings rate, and they were the world's largest trade surplus. So the Japanese were very competitive. They had a bubble. Had the government not interfered, prices, consumer prices, based on how efficient the Japanese economy was, we would have seen a rather substantial decline in consumer prices over that decade. The fact that that did not happen was a result of all the inflation that the Bank of Japan created. But just because prices didn't drop by 5% a year, instead they were flat, that doesn't mean there wasn't inflation. The inflation was the difference between the decline and prices being flat. So Japanese citizens were still robbed of the benefit of lower prices. The government still interfered with the economic rebalancing that was going to take place. The Japanese had a bubble in stocks and real estate for the same reason that we had a bubble. In the 80s, they kept their interest rates too low. And you know why they did that? To prop up the dollar. To keep the dollar from falling, they kept their rates low to make the yen less attractive. They wanted to maintain the American market for their exports. They're making the same mistake that the Chinese have been making. They're trying to preserve a market that's not worth preserving because we can't pay for anything. It's a perpetual vendor financing. And if you have to give your customers money to buy your product, then you need new customers. And to say that just because credit is being destroyed, you can't have hyperinflation, that's just not true. You have to also look at the velocity of money. You have to look at all the dollars around the world. And as our economy starts to contract, people aren't going to want to own our money. And they're not going to want to hold it. If people are willing to store money and not spend it, then prices won't start to spiral. But the minute all of our creditors, the minute the Chinese and the Japanese and the Saudis want out of their dollars, want to start spending their dollars, prices have to go through the roof because the money is coming back to our shores, bidding up prices. And then the government has to print even more money to deal with the consequences. It has nothing to do with the fact that a loan has gone bad. Just because, if I loan somebody money and they don't pay me back, the money isn't necessarily, I've lost it as a creditor, but the money the debtor still ended up spending the money. If you could simply, that argument is, we don't have to worry about bad loans. Because if we ever make a bad loan, the government can just print the money and pay it off, and it's like no damage has been done. But a lot of damage has been done. And that new money that's printed is not creating any purchasing power. There's no production associated with it. So all it can do is create inflation.
Hi, I have a question for Mountain View. Is oil a risky commodity to own since we are the biggest consumers and loss of our purchasing power means low demand?
Well, I think oil prices are going to go a lot higher. And I think ultimately, as the dollar collapses, Americans are going to consume a lot less oil. There's no question about that. We're going to demand a lot less. But the world is going to demand a lot more. Because as the dollar loses value, other currencies are gaining value. So as oil is becoming more expensive for Americans, it's becoming cheaper for somebody else. And so as we reduce our consumption, as we get priced out of the market, others consume more as they get priced in. So that's what's going to happen. So just because we consume less doesn't mean the prices are going to drop. On the contrary, I think prices are going to go up. I think they're going to go up spectacularly. I think oil prices are going to be a lot higher by the time Obama leaves office than they were at the peak before he came into office.
Thanks very much for coming in, Mr. Schiff. It was really interesting hearing you talk. One thing you mentioned was the fact that when we bailed out Lehman Brothers, you thought that was when we didn't bail out Lehman Brothers, you thought that was something that we should try more of. That in fact, right after that, we did a lot of bailouts, and that potentially caused a detrimental effect.
Well, and we also bailed out Bear before Lehman.
That's
I mean, we took a lot of bad debt off of Bear's books
Right.
and put it on the Fed.
So